everyone. This is Sarah Horvitz from Run for Something. I am the organizing director here. We are very excited to have a special presentation today from Dr. Michael Shank, who is the communications director at SDSN, and he is going to be talking about climate change policy. He has a really fun webinar planned today, and I will let him take it from here.
Thanks, Sarah. Greetings, everyone. It's great to be with you. Thanks for spending some time with me tonight. So I hope it's going to be fun. An evening on a Monday shouldn't be ever text heavy, so I've got a lot of pictures, and hopefully it'll be a good conversation once we get into Q&A. So here's my title, Building Public and Political Will for Climate Action. This is who I am. As Sarah mentioned, I handle communications for the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which helps communicate around the world on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN recently adopted and every country recently adopted. I also teach at NYU. I teach on sustainable development and climate security there. I used to be the director of media strategy at Climate Nexus. The only reason I mention Climate Nexus is that they are a pro bono climate comms shop. And I can send out later, or if you reach out to me at the end of the presentation, I can send you some URLs that help with basic climate communications, some of which we'll talk about today, but Climate Nexus should be a resource if you want it. And they've got a lot of incredible tips and techniques around climate communications. And I used to run their media shop there. So I'm happy to share that because I think you should make use of those resources if you want them. Used to work on the Hill, so I'm very familiar with politics. Used to handle climate policy, environmental policy, and foreign policy for a member of Congress. And so I understand the struggle in making these scientific issues palatable and public-facing and friendly for what is potentially a lay audience. And at the end, I write a lot and comment a lot. I say that because I'm always testing out my own language with the press and with the public. So I'm in it with you in terms of finding the right language that's going to resonate with the American public. These are the 4 things we'll talk about tonight. We'll talk about some effective, in terms of what I think are effective messages, frames, campaigns for communicating climate and environmental policy. Also talk about and give an overview of what resonates with the public. Third, we'll look at what policies are the easiest to implement in terms of climate policies, environmental policies for you locally. So as you're campaigning locally, I understand it's a mix of local and state, but some palatable stuff for your local publics I think will be important to address. And then fourth, what communications approaches to pursue. So if you missed it last week, we had some shocking news. Yet again, we're hitting records. Hopefully you saw this already, so this is old news, I assume, for many of you, but 2016 was the hottest year on record, and we keep breaking the records. I put at the top, if you'll see the science, and then a parenthetical, though facts and figures rarely move people. It's important for us to start with some basic foundation here, but not to rely on it, because I think most people, if you see what changes people, what wins the hearts and minds, it's not usually the facts or the figures, it's not usually the science, unfortunately. And as you know, science is under attack in this country. So relying on this, while an important foundation, isn't going to be the main focus of our talk today. I encourage you to check out the Bloomberg Carbon Clock. My friend Eric Roston, who's a sustainability editor at Bloomberg, created this. It's very interesting and overwhelming in terms of what's happening, but we're also at the highest parts per million in terms of particulates in the air. So it's the most polluted it's ever been. So to reiterate on these 2 slides, it's the hottest on record, and we have the most pollution in the skies, the carbon emissions. So if you ever need images, some of these images could be useful to you from the Bloomberg Carbon Clock. People are visual learners, so this stuff I find helpful. You can see 11,000 years ago, all the way up until today, you can see where we are with our parts per million in terms of the particulates in the air. So, number 1, some effective messages, frames, campaigns for communicating climate policy. While you may not think I would lead with an Old Spice ad, I'm saying this because with climate policy and environmental policy, a lot of people perceive it to be very heavy-handed, very laden with facts and figures, and a lot of our environmental communicators and messengers out there are lacing their messages with mostly facts and figures. And a lot of people don't track with that. They don't engage with that. why I put this Old Spice here is that I'm going to go through a few marketing ads and images to get us to think creative about how we talk about these issues. Now, clearly they created a meme that was very successful, Old Spice. You can see on the right, in terms of the PowerPoint, the traction on social media. But what they also did in Old Spice that I think is relevant to any of the campaigning that you're going to do is that they did a lot of individual tailored responses to every single, not quite everyone because it was overwhelming, the social media response, but they picked randomly several hundred, now probably several thousand responses, tailored responses. This was not directed to me. My first name is Michael. This says, "Happy birthday, Michael." This was not a back and forth with me, though I picked it because I thought it was appropriate. Thinking about how you engage with your audience and your followers, making sure you're offering and providing tailored response, not unlike the Old Spice ad campaign, which was very tailored. People then did their own "I'm on a horse" versions of it. And it was very popular because of its interaction with the audience. If you're familiar with the Geico commercials, the reason I bring this up here is a stuntman cheating death. And in this 30-second commercial, he cheats death in a race, 10K, it looks like. I say this because Geico, as you know, spends a lot of time not talking about what they're selling, and at the very end, they reiterate what they're selling. This is important for climate policy too, because a lot of people aren't going to want an overwhelming pitch when it comes to the facts and figures. In fact, what they're going to be interested in is you and trustworthiness and believability. And so how do you establish that foundation before the end, where you touch a little bit on climate, but building a whole different relationship with your audience before you ever touch on climate? Whereas I see and I find a lot of climate messengers lead heavy with the facts before developing the relationship with the audience. And sometimes we need to distract first with this and then close with the science. This I put up here because Timberland has done an incredible job showing their footprint for their shoes. And for this, for you, and I'll talk about this later too, is that any of you advocating on climate or environmental policy, it's really important to walk the talk and do everything you can to showcase your own initiatives, your own environmental initiatives, what you've done to your house, to your food, to your fashion, to your commute, anything you can talk to, obviously humbly and not arrogantly, because nobody wants that, nothing holier than thou, but anytime you can talk to what you're doing and showcase your own footprint, it really invites people to have a conversation with you. And if you approach it like, hey, you know, I haven't fully figured this out either, but I'm trying this out and I'm trying that out and I'm trying to change my imprint and footprint when it comes to fashion, food, and commuting and your house, weatherization, etc. It opens up a conversation that I think will invite more participation in the end. Just as an example, so as a vegetarian, I've been a vegetarian for 20 years for environmental reasons, and more recently over the last couple of years, changing my fashion footprint to move away from fast fashion so that I'm buying organic fibers and I'm buying fair trade clothing, but I haven't fully changed my wardrobe. So when I talk about it with anyone, my students at NYU or UN ambassadors, etc., I try to show that I'm on that path too. I haven't fully figured it out, and I'm trying to change slowly but surely. And it usually allows me to walk with someone, not preach at someone. This was a campaign by the Japanese Environmental Ministry, and I'm not encouraging you to weigh heavily with your own campaigns, but I bring this up because this was an attempt to change norms. And I think as a candidate, you do have some bandwidth to throw some ideas out there that can hopefully change norms. Now, obviously you want it to be believable and feasible and possible, so it can't be completely outside the realm of what's doable. But here was a government campaign to change the way in which men see fashion and how they're dressing. So in the summer, when it's hot, rather than wearing a suit and a tie, requiring more air conditioning, couldn't we change fashion norms so that it's acceptable for a man to wear sometimes a short sleeve shirt, button up, no tie? You see on the right, the tie was banned. And so you wouldn't have to use as much air conditioning. So when you engage any of these policies, climate and environmental policies, have fun with it. This was a fun campaign. They also have a biz campaign related to warm clothing and cold weather. So they have a warm biz campaign. This was their super cool biz. And I encourage you to think outside the box here in terms of proposing campaigns and have fun with it. This is by WWF. As you can see, it was very in your face and integrated. And as you went for your towel, you saw the forest depleted in the Amazon. That's what's intended to happen here. As you take a towel, and what WWF is trying to indicate is that you're cutting trees as you take these towels. Benefit here in terms of what or how it could apply to your work, making sure that it's doable and it's integrated. I'll give one quick example. In my town, I live in Peekskill, which is just north of New York City. Basic water fountains in the library and the community college and city hall so that we could fill up our water bottles. Simple stuff like that hadn't happened, and a basic proposal to integrate it was met with welcome. People are like, oh, that's great, we should totally do that. These kind of things, small but very important. Think about how you can use a water fountain or a paper dispenser to educate. Sorry, I think I have to, there we go. Every time I hit my arrow, it takes a minute. I put this here. You can see horrifying in the left, more horrifying in the right in terms of protecting marine life, but in this case, sharks and shark fin. Why I set this up here in terms of our marketing 101, thinking about contrasting what's possible with what's happening. And I help cities often in spelling out goals for 2030 and creating metrics for 2030 and where do we want to be in 2030? And that's a question I've asked my own town, city of Peekskill. What do we want Peekskill to look like in 10, 15, 20 years? And are we making the decisions now to set up the green infrastructure, or you name it, fill in the blank, so that by 2030, we are where we want to be? And this is a good example of the contrast between current reality and future reality if we don't change course. This is another campaign that I thought was very effective in terms of its alarm and eye-catching. And so in any of your campaigning, think about being very creative and potentially alarming so you get people's attention. No surprise, we're very distracted by our various social media, and increasingly you see people walk down the street and sidewalk, not paying any attention to where they're going and only looking at their smartphone. Things like this get people's attention. So as you think about how you communicate and how you campaign, how to add creativity in all of it so you get people's attention. There's one more by WWF in terms of not buying exotic animal souvenirs. Obviously getting your attention, you get a normal picture of an airport, some blood coming out of the suitcase as if she's trafficking souvenirs, animal souvenirs. Again, just thinking about how we can use and be savvy in our use of sensational material where appropriate, obviously done tastefully, and I'm happy to be in conversation with any of you about this kind of work if you're interested in pursuing it. Okay, let's get into some messages. There are three messages that I generally like to use when talking about climate and environmental policy. I tend not to rely on an environmental message, and I tend not to rely on a moral message or a humanitarian message. I tend to rely only on three messages, which I'll talk about right now. An economic message, a health message, and a security message. Why? And it may feel disrespectful to not address moral or stewardship, environmental or humanitarian. But the reason why I touch on economic, health, and security is because that's what tracks with much of the public. This is what they're thinking about. So here's a picture after Hurricane Sandy of some of the devastation, the economic cost to our society from climate change. There are plenty of data out there and facts and figures in terms of the estimation of the damage from climate change now or in the future. And if you want to talk about subsidies in terms of what our governments are paying to clean up the pollution, since it's social, we don't need to get too deep into this, but the socialization of some of these negative externalities where governments are cleaning up pollution from any of the polluters out there. I just want to quickly recommend IMF's $5.3 trillion study. The study didn't cost that much, but they showed that subsidies, what governments are paying to clean up the pollution, is running governments a tab of $5.3 trillion. So while it may not be relevant to you locally, if you want to source any of this or have data for any of this or have facts for any of this, it's out there. I'm happy to send it to you. But a quick note, the IMF has a good one But if any of you are on the East Coast, you know the damage that Hurricane Sandy did, up to 100 billion in terms of damage. This damage will only increase in terms of frequency that we'll see on the coast for sure, but extreme weather across the country. Montana fires right now are a great example of that. With every cost, there's a benefit. And here are the rankings of the most livable cities. So as you're talking about the cost, make sure you always have a benefit, because people don't just want doomsday. They want opportunity, and they want the solution, and they want the answer. So when you talk about livable cities, livable towns, livable states, there are some great rankings out there. There's some great data out there. So you can make the case for why it's economically beneficial to your town or to your state to be the most livable, to have the best air, to have the best water, to have the best commute, things like that. Think about the health costs. So this is the International Energy Agency's estimation in 2016 of global dead in terms of number of deaths every year from air pollution. I think in the US it's around 200,000, so you could figure out what it is for your state or what it is for your locality or county, because I'm sure you can find those numbers, and again, if you need help looking for them, I'm happy to help. But this is the global numbers in terms of 6.5 million dead each year from air pollution. So that's obviously an incredible, significant health cost. Another example of health costs, fastest warming cities. The US, though you see a lot of Europe on here, the US is rapidly warming. And if you give me your locale and you need help finding about temperature rise in your town or state, I'm happy to help you find that as well. I'm sure it's out there. If you've not seen it already, you can get some others. Also, I encourage you to check out the American Lung Association. They rank your air. And so I live in a county that has and has had F level, F grade air. So I'm living in some pretty bad air thanks to a waste to energy plant and a few other plants that are polluting nearby. But that can help you with your messaging as well. Of course, with the health cost, there's a health benefit. Here's an example on the left of America's top 10 cleanest cities. Some may surprise you. Some surprised me, I'll say. Some were the usual suspects. But again, in terms of positioning to your audience and your constituency, the opportunity here in terms of saving lives and living longer and living better and living healthier, there's a lot of great data out there, and I encourage you to use it in terms of making the case, hey, let's do right on climate so that we have the health benefit of living longer, living better, living happier. Lastly, the security cost. So this is a picture of the Maldives government hosting a cabinet meeting underwater. This was pre-Copenhagen. In Copenhagen in 2009, they were having what is now known as the Paris climate process. They had it back then in Copenhagen. They had the climate agreement discussed then. It wasn't signed like it is now in Paris. But right before that, the Maldives government said to the Copenhagen talks, hey, if you don't act quick on climate change, sea level rise is going to consume us. This is our new reality. We're going to be underwater. This got a lot of attention. And so when you think about, again, from a campaigning perspective, how you can showcase the security threats. Another quick example from my town, city of Peekskill, while the city council and the mayor don't really buy into the climate conversation, and that's a non-starter with my mayor, I did see the entirety of city staff, planning staff at a meeting that looked at resilience, which we'll talk about in a second, in terms of how sea level rise and storm surge would impact my river town, Peekskill. What city resources, what city assets would be impacted by sea level rise and storm surge, because in the next 30 years, we're going to see a 2-foot level rise impacting Peekskill. So 2 more feet of water. We definitely have resources and assets on the water, and that got my city council and city planners' attention immediately. So around security, you have an opportunity to talk to your constituencies in a way that you don't if you lead only with environmental or moral or humanitarian. Here's the security benefit on the left. I know it's very small font, but you could Google this, most resilient cities. Toronto leading, Vancouver, Calgary, go Canada. Chicago, the 4th though. So for those of you in Chicago, kudos to your resiliency. And so this is a great language to use in terms of being resilient to extreme weather, whether it's drought, whether it's storms, whether it's sea level rise, any of the extreme weather that can be related to climate change, and increasingly it is. Use this language because people will understand it. So just wrap up there, the economic cost, the economic benefit, the health cost, the health benefit, the security cost, the security benefit. Overview of what resonates with the public. Just a couple slides here. So if you've not seen Yale and George Mason's polling on climate attitudes and climate behaviors, I highly recommend it. If you just Google Yale, GMU, George Mason, climate opinion polling, you'll find their work. But the good news is that the majority of the American public does believe that global warming is happening. And I use this slide and the next two slides all the time. So I think good campaigning is convincing the publics of something that you're already convinced on or about. So lead with conviction. And if we lead saying, hey, listen, the majority of the American public is on board. They know climate change is happening. The polling's out there, the data are out there. We know this is real. That's not the issue. Now we have to act. It's all about behaviors. So if you set the foundation in your conversation with conviction, it's very difficult for someone to challenge that. So I leave this here because it's an important starting point where you can just start with this, nod your head, and it's like, yeah, the majority of the American public is behind us on it. Similarly, look at these numbers. Good solid majority of the American public supports the regulation of CO2 as a pollutant. Very few people in America are okay with rampant, excessive pollution. So again, another nice starting point. Listen, all of us in the room, majority of the American public supports regulating carbon emissions as a pollutant. And again, strong majority support funding research into renewable energy resources. So majority of the American public supportive of putting money behind, federal money, state money behind renewable energy. I put this up here because my friends over in New York City did a great job of market research and polling, but they also, look at the language, they also use it to move the conversation forward when anyone is looking at this ad. And so if you could get some local polling too, or even use this language, because this language can't be refuted. Look at the bottom. More and more New Yorkers are carrying reusable bags. Join in. Now, they had some market research behind this, but this is also a statement that can't be challenged because as they were rolling them out, indeed, as they were handing out reusable bags, indeed, more and more New Yorkers were using reusable bags. But it's a great affirmative, so when someone reads this, they're like, oh, wow, this is a movement, this is momentum, I should join in, that kind of thing. So think about how to use this kind of language too. Well, climate policies are the easiest to implement. Now, obviously, this depends on where you're at, so I'm just gonna offer a few out there, not exhaustive at all. This is an example of what I did in Peekskill. I helped lead this campaign to Solarize Peekskill. It was a limited campaign, it was 3 months. We did get some support from the state in terms of wraparound services in the campaign, but it was largely volunteer-led. I serve on the Conservation Advisory Council in the city of Peekskill. And so I and a few others volunteered to do events, go door to door, call people, market the heck out of this so that people would get on board in this limited time, couple months. Yes, the rates were a little lower, but frankly, not significantly lower. There is benefit in creating a campaign that is time limited, and you'll find, and you already know this perhaps, and what I found is that anyone who sees solar on their neighbor's roof or in the community, they're much more likely to put solar on the roof if they see it. So thinking about that and social capital and how we maximize existing solar arrays in our towns and in our states to then inspire other people to get on board is going to be key. Happy to share more. There's a website here that has some of it. But thinking about how you could lead a campaign in your town to solarize, fill in the blank. Zero carbon buildings may be too aggressive for some of you in terms of your jurisdiction or your mandate and where you're running. But I think it can be part of the conversation because that's where we want to go. And a lot of cities like New York City are thinking about building zero carbon buildings, and California is mandating by 2025 that all new buildings have to be zero carbon. And you can do that. You can see on the right, there's some specifics about zero carbon. I won't get into it specifically in terms of policy. Feel free to look it up in terms of how it's done. And you can obviously generate renewable energy in the building and on the building and perhaps offset it with purchases to make sure it's zero carbon or carbon neutral. But on the left, this is low-hanging fruit in terms of weatherization. Every house desperately needs, including the house that I'm talking from right now, my house, desperately needs some kind of weatherization, whether it's insulation or it's the windows or the doors, you name it. And a lot of people don't take up their states on the offers to weatherize. New York is a great example of this, where they market it heavily throughout the state, and a lot of people aren't getting on board the weatherization trend, even though there's a lot of state support for it. And for whatever reason they're not. And it's probably primarily because their communication has largely been online. And so this is something, if your state is doing this, if your locality is doing this, for you to become a messenger of it and really pick up this, if you've not, pick up this mantle and run with it, because the opportunities here for efficiency and cost savings, I think, could appeal to a wide constituency. San Francisco diverts 80 to 85% of its waste from the landfill. So that's recycling, composting, reusing. It's amazing and it's incredible. And other cities like New York have pledged to be zero waste, but they're not remotely near there. I brought this up with my town, and we got a lot of interest because there's a waste to energy plant that we want to shut down because it's so polluting. And so we talked about, well, how do we slow our waste so that we're not feeding that waste to energy plant with our waste? And so we're talking now whether or not to build some goals, some 2020, 2030 goals around zero waste, and then actively incentivizing recycling, providing for composting and reuse. Making mass transit pedestrian bike friendly towns, states. You're seeing this in more cities, which is great. So thinking about the simple things you can do in your town. City of Peekskill, again, doesn't have bike racks. And so that's something we're advocating for, so that people start to see bikers. Whenever I bike into town, drivers always look at me quizzically, like, what are you doing on a bike? So I'm trying to change that culture too, slowly but surely. Greening the city in terms, or state, in terms of roofs and gardens. I'm bringing this up from early 20th century in the wars, when we produced 40% of our food, our edible food, from new gardens that we planted everywhere. So the opportunity to green your roof, green your city, streets, etc., with gardens like this, it's ample, and it's could be an interesting talking point for people in the city or state to get into. Fourth, what communications approaches to pursue? Just going to quickly have 8 M's here, and then I'm finished. I'll go through them very quickly. Message, messenger, mainstream majority, mass media, meme, me, moment, and meetups. Things to remember as you're campaigning on climate or environmental policy. Message. So just to reiterate, from left to right, the economics, the health impacts, the security impacts. The economic impacts, the health impacts, the security impacts. That's what I lead with all of the time, versus environmental or humanitarian or moral. Now, if you were talking to a church or to a temple and you want to talk about stewardship and use scripture or religious texts, etc., obviously we're going to craft a moral message for an audience that tracks with the moral. And if you're talking to first responders and you're talking about the humanitarian case, or you're talking about how climate change is impacting Syria, for example, there's clearly a humanitarian message to be made there. But in general, I would encourage you to pursue the economic, the health, and security. Messenger. This is Bill Gates drinking water. 5 minutes ago, this water was feces and urine, and this machine, which he helped fund, clean this water, purify the water. And Bill Gates, as you know, cares a lot about global health, and so this is part of his global health messaging. So thinking about surrogates who can advocate on behalf of you and for you, but also thinking about stunts that you can pull. Like the messenger moment here is and should be exploited in terms of the stunts that you can pull. You know, something I think about with Mayor de Blasio. If you really wanted to transition all the buses in New York City, which most of them are heavily polluting, they're not good electric buses, which are being made in China by the tens of thousands every year, is he could be in Fifth Avenue, sitting in the street and breathing in the emissions, thinking about the opportunities that you could do as a stunt to showcase the environmental problems in your town, locality, county, state, etc. Seizing what Bill Gates seized, knowing the theatrics here, getting a lot of press as a result. Mainstream majority, making sure we're always using language that the mainstream majority is using. You can see my most used words on Facebook. Just look at the words. They're pretty monosyllabic. They're not very thoroughly robust in terms of its use of the Webster Dictionary. Trying to say this as nicely as possible. So I say this because when we talk about climate or environmental policy, we can't use too many multisyllabic words. We can't use language that's too esoteric. We really have to make it accessible to the public. And this is just a reminder that these are the words that the public is most often using. Mass media, you know this, but I say this because oftentimes I find candidates, and I have some in my town, who don't want to engage some of the local media, and in part because the reporters have been antagonistic or sided with the other party, etc. But I'm a big believer in working in every outlet, provided you can have a conversation. Now, in Fox News space, sometimes you can't actually have a conversation, or you couldn't have a conversation with Bill O'Reilly as an example. But I prefer to write articles for USA Today versus New York Times, just because the readership is the mainstream majority in America, and it's using a mass media outlet that the mainstream majority is using. So thinking about your own local outlets, ones that you perhaps have stayed away from, I encourage you to tap into and just embrace it. Obviously transform that space so that you have the power in the conversation, which may not always be possible. A meme. So I'm a big believer in anything should be memeified. So any policy you have, any climate policy or environmental policy you want to propose or you are proposing, if we can't meme it, then we haven't done our work. And this is a no-brainer because obviously social media is full of memes, but testing it for meme potential I think is really important because that's what's going to allow for salience in social media. Me, walking the talk. So this is not quite the case that it once was with Leo DiCaprio, but Leo DiCaprio used to get a lot of flack for not walking the talk when it came to climate policy. He's a big climate champion, as you know. He's gotten better at it, but he used to roll up in his Escalades and SUVs to climate fundraisers and got a lot of crap for it, rightly. So again, walking the talk because your critics will love to poke holes at anything. And if you're talking climate policy or environmental policy and you're rolling up in an SUV that's not a hybrid or electric, you don't want to set yourself up for a vulnerable attack in that moment. And Leo, as you can tell, got a lot of criticism for that. So the onus is on us and to come upon us to make sure we're walking the talk, that we are the right messengers here. Moment, seizing the moment. This is just a screen pick of the top stories trending, no surprise in terms of what you're seeing. But I bring this up primarily because every day there's a media moment, and how can we seize on it? So last week it was 2016 is the hottest year on record. This week there's some more. If you follow Climate Nexus, they will daily subscribe you to a listserv and send you all the latest news trending that day. So if you go to climatenexus.org, sign up for the listserv, and it comes every day at 8 a.m., you will see what's trending that day. Use that, respond to that, make use of that in your talking points. It shows that you're tracking the news, shows you're in the know, and even pivot off that if you want to write something like a letter to the editor or an opinion piece for your local paper. Meetup. So I don't know how you feel about this, and I don't know how you've been coached in the following way, but I'm a big believer in embracing any attacker, and including reporter who wants to attack me for anything, or my previous boss, member of Congress. So I firmly believe in meetups. It's what I've done for my entire 20 years of work with the media and with press, meeting up for coffee, meeting up for lunch, and making sure that you're giving an opportunity to hear what the reporter is critiquing and building a relationship. If you build a relationship with that reporter and meet up with that reporter over coffee, tea, lunch, and again, I'm guessing a lot of you are doing this already, but some local candidates have surprised me in their reluctance to meet up with certain reporters who have been critical. And I was like, well, they're going to keep attacking you as long as you don't give them airtime and, you know, stroke their ego a little bit and make them feel important, especially with local reporters for small local outlets. They have big egos that doesn't match the bandwidth of their paper or their online outlet. And meeting up with them, taking them out for coffee or lunch, I think, can go far in establishing a relationship. Now, they might keep critiquing you and countering what you're saying, but I guarantee you they're going to see you differently. and likely, you know, whittle away at some of the sharper edges in their writing. So in summary, started with the foundation of the science, hottest year, highest submissions on record, got into campaign mode and some marketing 101. We looked at the economic health and security frames that I'm biased towards and I hope you use. And lastly, we finished with the 8 M's, thinking about the message, the messenger, the mainstream majority, the mass media, meeting up with reporters, seizing the moment, having a meme for everything, and then most importantly, me walking the talk. So I mentioned a bunch of resources and data on this presentation. Here's my email address at NYU. Feel free to email me if you want specific data. I'm happy to find it for you. And just a reminder to go to climatenexus.org for any of the tips and techniques around climate communications that I helped build when I was there. One more website, climatesignals.org. Climatesignals.org will have all the latest data around the signals around climate change, extreme weather, etc. So now I'm going to pull out of this and go to Q&A.